Hey guys, welcome to the channel. I hope you enjoy this Manhwa recap. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks. We see a lot of conflicting expressions on all the surrounding soldiers, because no one could have expected this. Even the third Oda starts cursing at the little brat, but Guen just smiles at his longtime friend. The soldiers erupt with cheers. Chris the Knight, they chant. The Baron thinks that this was Chris's goal all along. Not bad for a young lad. And by the Baron's power, he promotes Chris from the 7th Infantry to the position of Knight, and the soldiers continue to chant. Chris looks over and is signaled by Guen to meet him when he is done. The scene shifts to this conversation and Guen congratulates Chris on the promotion. Surely Guen didn't call him here just for that, right? They stop the pleasantries and Guen tells Chris that when he returns, he should seek the group named Centuria. The matter is not urgent, and Guen tells him to take his time, and then departs. And back at the 7th Infantry camp, the soldiers are celebrating the achievements of Chris, as he sits beside Kennery and asks him why he rejected his knighthood. Kennery ignores these words and gives him a blank stare, and says no matter how much he looks at Chris, he could only see him as an ordinary soldier. Chris is a little confused, but he asks Kennery his relationship with the Baron's illegitimate son, and even asks the man if he's a little drunk. Kennery said he vowed never to drink again. Kennery also asks Chris if he means to ally with Graf Guen. What are you gonna do next? Chris looks up to the sky and not even he knows. But if one day he calls for Kennery, will he come? Kennery lets off the soft smile and replies, anytime, Chris. And this is the end of our boy's journey with the 7th Infantry, and man, there was a lot of ups and downs, but this is one of my favorite parts of the story personally. But it's time for bigger and better things. Now our boys arrive in Daybed City, and Lind, farm boy at heart, is in awe of the sprawling commotion. The soldiers laugh at someone being so amazed by a simple city. Chris tells Lind to stop letting everyone know that he's a hillbilly, and ironically, Lind is being lectured by someone who lived down the street. Chris arrives at his room and lays down after a long journey, and after Chris's nap, he exits his quarters and Digo comes up to him with an important question. Chris says that he'll go with him after he's completed some tasks, and he needs to visit a certain place. Being a knight apprentice gives Chris a lot of freedom, and actually, a little side note, Chris wasn't promoted to knight right away, he became a knight apprentice first. And I guess that makes sense because, he's only fucking 15, but impressive nonetheless. But being a knight apprentice allows Chris to maneuver the city. He arrives at his destination after about a 5-minute walk, and he walks into the small potion shop. He inhales the smell of herbs and gets right to the point. He asks the salesman if he has a herb called Whitefinger, and man, this thing looks disgusting. Chris says that the importance of this herb has not yet been discovered, and in about 15 years, people will recognize it as a core ingredient for improving one's body. Chris offers a deal for 1 year. He will pay 1 copper coin for 1 white root finger. The man does not think that that's enough, and Chris sweetens the deal, saying how after the first month, he'll double the price. The man is still not interested, but Chris is not fucking around. What about 5 copper coins? This changed the man's tune and he shakes his hand, but the lady on the second floor says they'll agree on 4 copper coins, saying how it's important to build trust in a long-term relationship. The man reluctantly agrees and Chris has a deal. Chris pays the man in advance, and now we see the scene shift to nighttime. The moon is shining and Chris is seen walking with Digo in a nearby forest. Digo asks Chris what his real goal is. He answers vaguely, saying how he wants to go to the barracks and get some sleep, but Digo tells him to stop joking around. What are you really trying to achieve, Chris? Chris looks into the distance and tells him, the top, Digo. You mean a noble? No, even higher than that. I am an unknown and pitiful man, but I always wanted to be a part of something great. Digo starts to kneel and Chris is a little curious on why he's doing so, but Digo swears an oath to Chris, saying how he's met the man he wants to follow and will serve Chris until his dying breath. Chris is taken aback by this proclamation and he accepts and appoints Digo as his first knight. The next day comes and Chris is analyzing the city's military structure, and he notes that the camp is actually pretty big and the organization is much better than the 7th Infantry. Even cavalrymen are training here. Digo was even accepted into this unit, and man, I love to see the boys moving up in life. The place Chris is most interested in, however, is the drug depot in the barracks. Chris doesn't need to labor around and collect herbs, but knight apprentices are not allowed to use the drug depot, so he's going to need to get permission first. The chief of the camp, Streak, introduces himself to Chris as he's browsing around. Chris returns the formalities and Streak asks him to follow. They sit down in his office and gets right to business. This camp has no room for slackers. Doesn't matter who Chris is or if he's a war hero, and even assumes that Chris is the Baron's illegitimate son. Chris wonders who's spreading this misinformation, but Streak continues and informs him that his position allows him to leave the camp by finding a knight to follow. But if he wants to stay here, he needs to prove himself. Chris, with a determined look, says, give me 100 cavalrymen and I can show you what I'll do. The guy puts his hand on his face and wonders why this teenage boy asked for 100 elite cavalrymen. The man slams his hand on the table, saying he'll never trust the lives of 100 men to an arrogant brat like Chris. There are rules in this camp. Prove yourself in a duel, then we can talk. Chris keeps his cool and understands. He gets cocky and says to allow him to fight 3 enemies at once. That should suffice. This further enrages Streak. How can this boy fight 3 soldiers alone? A single opponent is enough. Meet at the dueling grounds at noon. Chris accepts and some time passes, and Lind even hears about the situation and is concerned on how Chris is handling it. But once he wins, everything should be fine. Chris is facing Paylor, and he's known for his strength around these parts and has never lost a duel. Chris says that this might be true, but the man doesn't have real battle experience. Lind further says that Paylor won 10 duels in a row and has garnered the nickname Paylor the Undefeated. Chris is unfazed and confident in his abilities as he swings his spear. He gets a notification that his spear mastery is increased to 32. Chris isn't even worried about the duel, but is worried about leveling his XP. Once he hits a wall like this, it's hard to gain levels through physical training. The 2 kids see winter snow, and now we're taken to the duel between Chris and Paylor. Paylor says he won't go easy on the boy, but this is what Chris wanted. The surrounding soldiers start betting on the outcome, and Paylor is the heavy favorite. They're underestimating our boy for sure. Only Lind and Digo know the true skill of Chris, and Chris begins to take note of Paylor and comes to understand that he has a similar build to Digo. Let's see if he can match up. But before the match starts, Chris looks at the ground and notices that the snow has melted and the training grounds are covered with a thin layer of ice. Shriek calls for the start of the duel, and Paylor wastes no time and charges right at Chris. He thrusts and slash, but Chris dodges and blocks the attacks. The 2 lock eyes and begin to exchange blows, and Paylor wonders how long Chris can last just defending. Chris only thinks this guy is talking too much, and Paylor notices something wrong with Chris's sword and sees an opening. But before he can get that opportunity to capitalize, Chris shuts down the attempt. Paylor is shocked at the boy's sheer speed, and they distance themselves. Paylor charges in with another thrust, but this was a bait by Chris. He made him come in, and the slippery footing made it easy for Chris to exploit his movements. Paylor slips, and Chris pounced on him, spear in hand. Chris knocks the sword out of Paylor's hand in midair, and the helpless man falls to the floor, but is greeted with Chris's spearhead as he tries to get up. Chris is the winner of the duel, and he gives Paylor a lesson saying how in battles, there are numerous variables. Chris confidently walks past Screet and tells him that if now, he can use the drug depot. Screet is mad about the money he just lost, but agrees that this was their deal. Digo and Lind nod with approval at their commander's success, and now we see Chris in the drug depot and finds many useful herbs that the soldier that was in charge of inventory tells him that they were just about to throw all of those out. No, this won't do. From now on, bring Chris all of these herbs. We now see him in front of a steaming bath as he praises that the Baron does not cut any corners. He adds a combination of white finger and other herbs to the water. Even Chris's past teacher was unaware of this concoction. Bathing in this water will turn an ordinary person into a vessel for accumulating inner energy. The process will take at least a year, but it's good to start now. Chris submerges himself in water and reflects on his duel with Paylor. He's disappointed that he still needs these underhanded strategies and is too weak. It's no time to fool around. Chris needs to find his teacher. We're now introduced to the chakra, the key, the cursed energy, whatever the hell you want to call it of this story. So in this, it's going to be called Wise, and it's the mysterious energy that separates ordinary soldiers from the elite. It's almost like comparing a tiger to a rabbit. However, there was an instance of a rabbit being able to kill a tiger. Chris's old master, Taikil, even taught a one-handed cripple like him martial arts. Chris is stressed, however, because where on earth is he going to meet him again? It's been over a month and there isn't a single trace of his old teacher. He did remember that he met him in daybed before, but he struggles to search his memory for more clues. Chris curses himself for not having all the details, but how is he supposed to know he was going to go into the past? Chris then has a revelation. That's right, Taikil had a daughter. Later that night, at the Crossroads Inn, we see Chris sitting down with the boys sharing a drink. Doki, with a pretty blank face, says his second line of the whole story so far, and just says how beer doesn't taste good. Even Chris chimes in and congratulates him for speaking in a full sentence, and that kind of cracks me up a little bit. I guess Doki didn't know the language, and Lind has been teaching him for a little bit. Chris takes a sip and ponders on viable candidates for his master's daughter. Chris begins eyeing up the waitress as she takes their order for another 4 portions, and he remembers that his master's daughter is supposed to have magnificent eyes, and the chances of this waitress being Ellis is quite low. A drunk Doki says his second line for the entire chapter, and I'm all here for it. Chris notes that the waitress's build and stride is similar to Digo and thinks that it's a pity that such a beauty is in a place like this. The waitress scolds Doki, telling him how if he complains again, he can leave. And Chris says that this short temper is another reason that he believes that she cannot be Ellis. The door swings open and Chris looks to see who it is, and just like his motherfucking plot armor, his former teacher walks into the bar. Well, this wasn't much of a problem, was it? The lady at the desk asks Taikyo what he needs, and he says he wants some food and a room for the night. It turns out that this waitress was in fact Ellis, and immediately one drunk man tries to smash. But Ellis has a fiery temper and quickly rejects the poor guy. The man didn't take this lightly, however, and grabs her by the collar, saying how she doesn't even have a husband. Who is she to reject him? The situation escalates and Chris stands from his seat, and the drunk man continues to ramble on. But now, an enraged father grips the back of this guy's head and slams him into the ground. If you're gonna put your hands on a girl, you might get a concussion. Taikyo says a pretty smooth one-liner there, and I guess don't put your hands on women, cause you might die. I don't know about concussion, he hit him pretty hard. He begins to yell at the man that if he does something like this again, he will regret it. Chris is shocked because the Taikyo he knows never showed emotion like this. Don't mess with a proud father, I guess. Ellie grabs his coat and tells him to stop, causing a commotion, and Chris finally gets to this realization that the waitress is indeed Ellis. The two men stand up and Chris calls for Digo, who towers over the soldiers blocking their path. Ellis now scolds Digo for trying to help her, ? She needs to get her priorities in check. He's trying to help you, woman. Chris approaches and tells Taikyo not to pull his weapon from his coat, and he asks Chris if he wants to fight too, and he's ready to tear him apart. But Chris slowly diffuses the situation and he introduces himself as a knight apprentice. The soldiers immediately recognize him and they realize that Centurion Digo was the one in front of them. They quickly apologize for their wrongdoings, and Chris lets Taikyo know about the strict rules in Daybed, and if anyone dies in this bar, Ellis will be held responsible as the owner of this inn. Taikyo realizes he took it too far, and finally Ellis warms up to him and thanks him for doing that. Taikyo takes his leave and Ellis is confused on how he caused such a ruckus and left. Chris says that the man will return and Ellis wonders what his connection is to him. Another baddie comes up to Chris, but this savage doesn't even look at her. Apparently, this is the 4th time someone tried to hook up with him. Bro, what? Like, I was not getting girls like this at 15. I don't even get girls like that now. Fuck Chris. Ellis notes that Chris is quite popular, but Chris quickly declines the girl and asks for how much the price is to stay here for the night. Ellis responds that the price is 3 copper coins, and the gold digger chimes in that a man like Chris doesn't need to sleep in this place, which annoys Ellis. She asks who this bitch is, that's her words, not mine, and she's introduced as Sir Zaren's 3rd daughter. The drunk boys have no idea who Zaren is and make fun of her for not even being a noble. Chris sighs with his hand to his forehead, and even Doki chimes in, me angry. I love this guy, man. Chris calms his friends down, like, what are you guys, alcoholics? How much did you drink? That's enough. The next day comes and Chris sits and looks towards Taikyo, notes how he's a regular guest here. He caused some problems before, but now he seems pretty quiet. Chris needs to progress things, however, and asks a leading question to Ellis. By the way, don't you miss your dad? She says that she does, but it doesn't matter how she feels. If he wanted to see her, then he would have came. Chris adds that, don't you think he's looking for you secretly? But Ellis quickly knocks it down, saying that her father isn't the type of person to peek from far away, and he would have found her already if he was looking. Chris just thinks if that's the case, and smiles as he gets up and asks to have a cup of tea with Taikyo. Chris thinks that Taikyo isn't really talkative and starts the conversation by asking if he came from Central Shed. He agrees and asks how he knew, but Chris just responds saying that he's seen many nobles tying waist straps the same way he does, and they all come from Central Shed. Chris inquires on what made him come all the way up here, and Taikyo just says that this is his hometown. Any family? Chris asks, and this is quite a shocking question to Taikyo, as he's startled by it. Chris begins reading the man, saying how his eyes are filled for concern at the waitress, and you care for her as you look at her. For lovers, there's too big of an age difference. Could Ellis perhaps be your daughter? Taikyo is shocked at this acute observation, but we all know Chris is fucking cheating right now, so this isn't fair. Chris calls to Ellis and Taikyo has a nervous sweat. He offers a seat and says this man has something to tell you. Chris exits the room and Ellis is confused with the situation. We see a next shot as Chris watches outside the door at a loud scream from Ellis. What? It's a big realization there, but Chris just helped speed things up. Chris looks intently at Taikyo and asks him to teach him the art of wielding weapons. Chris says he's a knight apprentice, but still doesn't have a teacher. Taikyo asks further on what he means, and he said that Baron Ved Lugwood promoted him to the position of knight apprentice, but didn't appoint a knight for him to follow. Chris rejects ordinary knights, and he wants to learn from Taikyo. He doesn't want to have the regular skills of an intermediate knight. He wants to master the powers of wise, so he can rule the entire continent. Taikyo thinks this isn't too big of a deal, since he does owe Chris one for speeding up the process of meeting his daughter again. But before he agrees, he asks Chris how he found information on him. Chris thinks that if he avoids answering this question, it's going to lead to suspicion, but comes up with the on-the-fly answer saying if Tykiel heard about Baron van Ludwig's illegitimate son. Tykiel assumes that the two are connected, and he said through him he learned that there was rumors of a retired knight from the royal guard coming to Daybed. Chris couldn't miss this opportunity to be taught by a former member of the royal guard, and he could have never imagined that Ellis was his daughter, and Ellis is like a sister to him. And man, he's really milking this. Look at his face, man. He's lying through his teeth right now. Tykiel tells Chris that maybe this is what they call fate as he takes another sip from his tea, but informs him that he's never had an apprentice and asks Chris to spar. The scene shifts to an open field as Chris readies himself for the spar, and Tykiel admires the boy's fighting spirit. Tykiel signals for the start of the spar and readies his foot to push off the ground. He tells Chris that it's time to dance, and he lunges towards the boy with incredible speed. As soon as Chris tries to swing at him to stop his attack, he immediately dodges and goes into his blind spot. Chris is shocked at the speed as he turns around, but receives a heavy blow that he barely manages to block, and the impact can be seen going through his back. Chris is sent flying back a couple meters as he regains his footing, and wonders how hard Tykiel can hit with just a wooden stick. Tykiel wonders if all the boy has is self-confidence, but Chris can only think that it's incredible that it's so hard to just avoid his attacks. Then Tykiel charges in again and lets off 3 simultaneous strikes of his spear at Chris, which catches him off guard. 3 jabs at once? Chris doesn't know how to react and can only block 2 of the strikes, with the remaining one hitting him right in the chest. Chris eats the blow but says now it's time to unveil some of his tricks. He returns and lunges at Tykiel, showing off some of his own talent by recreating the move that was just used on him. Tykiel is shocked that the boy actually just copied him. Chris says that, you saw it for your own eyes, didn't you? Tykiel can only think what potential this young boy has and is truly interested in him now. But the scene fast forwards to Chris being forced to yield with Tykiel's spear at his face. Chris wants to go again, but Tykiel smiles and lifts him from the ground. Do you really want to learn from me? He asks. Chris says that this was exactly what he wanted from the very beginning, and he wants to be taught by Tykiel. Tykiel reminds him that he's too weak right now and to come meet him in 3 days. Chris lays back on the dirt, reflecting on the situation, thinking how tough this training is going to be. And he had 12 chances to hit Tykiel, but failed to even graze his collar. What was the reason? Chris mentioned that he defeated high-level 8-gate soldiers on the battlefield, and they're considered to be well-trained. Did he not take this spar seriously? No, that can't be. He tried his absolute best today. Maybe he was overestimating himself. Perhaps this is the true difference between a regular soldier and a wise knight. And now we see Chris conversing with Screet, and he tells him that since he's Baron van Ludwig's apprentice, he cannot let anyone beat him. And if he doesn't have a knight to follow, he can always come to him. Screet, I love the enthusiasm, bro, but I think you're a little weak compared to Tykiel, if I'm gonna be honest. Chris tells him not to worry and that it was just a simple spar, but his face says otherwise. He tells Screet that he's just a little exhausted right now and he wants to get some sleep. Screet can only wonder who on earth beat Chris to such a point. Nighttime comes and Ellis is sitting next to Tykiel and tells him that it's a bit uncomfortable to call him dad, so she'll just call him by his first name. Tykiel tells her to do as she wishes and they continue their conversation. Ellis asks why he left their stepmother and her. Tykiel sighs and says that he didn't know it was going to turn out like that. He was moving up the military ladder, but was starting to feel ashamed of what he was becoming and how he spent 20 years of his life running away. He never really wanted to live a life like that. Ellis then asks him what happened to her birth mother, but Tykiel has a very dark look on his face. We don't actually see what he says, but we see the reaction of Ellis, who has a tear in her eye. Some time passes and Tykiel apologizes, but Ellis grabs his hand in this very touching father and daughter moment and tells him that it's fine as she wipes away her tears. Ellis changes the subject and asks Tykiel what is he doing with Chris now. Tykiel responds saying, what about Chris? But Ellis is not stupid and knows that Chris has asked him something. Tykiel says that he asked him to teach him to master weapons, and Ellis excitedly gets closer to her father and asks him to teach her as well. Tykiel feels a little confused, but Ellis continues saying that she always wanted to be a knight since she was a child. Ellis' stepmother never liked her fighting, but still, this is a dream that she wanted to pursue. Her talents are wasted in this inn since she's not that good of a cook and she hates all the housework that she's forced to do. Tykiel agrees, and now we see Ellis training with Chris. Chris is given some hand weights and asks if he's really meant to train with these on. Tykiel tells him that his body is still way too weak to wield the weapon, so first he needs to improve his stamina. Chris wonders why Ellis isn't wearing the same bracers, and she just gives him a sly look saying that's because she's his daughter after all, as the two begin to start their run. Pumpkin now joins the two on their run, and Ellis asks if the good wolf likes running with them. She asks Chris where he found this absolute treasure, and Chris just tells her to stop talking and keep running. Now we see Chris doing squats and pull-ups with the weights still on, on, Chris thinks that in his past life, the training was not this rigorous. Was Taikyo going easy on him since he was crippled? He loses his strength on the pull-up bar and slams to the floor. It's hard, isn't it? Taikyo remarks. Chris wonders if this training is even necessary, and he wants to master the skills that he needs to be a knight. Taikyo reminds him that he'll never improve without the basics, and he can't master these so-called skills until he gets the stamina that he needs, including building his muscle mass. Taikyo tells him to come back in a week. Eating and resting well is also a part of his training. Chris finally gets a chance to relax as he soaks himself in his herbal bath, and he thinks that he has to endure this training. The scene shifts back in 3 days, and Chris returns with kind of a smug look on his face. Taikyo is a little shocked that he came back so early, and he thinks his recovery speed is incredible for having such a weak body. Chris just tells him that he knows how to use some medicinal herbs. Ellis is seen running and wonders if she became slower. But Taikyo tells her that she didn't get slower, it's just that Chris got a lot faster. Chris gets a prompt from the system saying that his experience has increased. He pulls up his artifact screen and jumps for joy that finally he got some levels from physical training. And now, the next panel, we see a shot of Chris looking absolutely jacked reading a book. Lind enters the tent and asks Chris what he's been up to these days. Chris thinks that it would be very beneficial to have the 3 boys train with him, but currently they're under Streak's command. Lind leaves his book and lays down on the bed, and Chris asks him if he really plans on spending all his money on books. Lind tells him that this is the only source of entertainment he has for now, and the last time he participated in the last strategy meeting, the superiors told him that a kid shouldn't meddle in military affairs. It almost feels like the 3 boys aren't even centurions at all. He wants to ask Chris something. If it continues like this, will it be alright? Because right now, the 3 boys are not capable as anything as soldiers. Chris thinks that this is exactly how he felt in his previous life. And how can he help train the 3 boys? Chris closes his eyes and knows what he's certain about. If you want to change something, you have to climb higher. Len says that the only way he knows is to stay alive on the battlefield. He was just feeling a little down and wanted to complain to Chris for a little bit, and tells him that Commander Streak was looking for him. Chris wonders why he didn't start with this information, since technically Chris is his superior. Lin just laughs it off, saying that he'll start working hard from now on, Sir Knight Apprentice. Chris thinks that the boy is just a lousy messenger, and he enters Streak's tent and asks if he was looking for him. Streak sits down and gets right to the point and asks Chris to stop utilizing the drug depot. Chris is shocked at this request, and Streak tells him that the amount of herbs that he used has exceeded the yearly amount, and he's had to pay for them out of his own pocket. And last night he was caught by his wife, and we see the proof on his face with a very distinct slap mark. Chris is a little taken aback, and Streak asks him to please understand his situation. Chris thinks if he can use this situation correctly, he still may be able to salvage the herbs. He slams his hand on the table and begs for Streak's forgiveness. He'll take responsibility for what happened, but it might sound weird, but please make Chris in charge of the drug depot. He'll solve all the financial problems in 2 months. Streak wonders how confident the boy is, and Chris tells him to just give him 3 soldiers under his command. This was a good plan, as we see the 3 boys approaching Chris, and he tells him that this is the start of their official training. Chris tells Taikyo, since you need money to buy flowers for Ellis, maybe you can train my 3 friends as well. He laughs and agrees and says that he'll take in any students as long as they can endure his trainings. Chris leaves the 3 in his care and then moves on to finally figure out the financial struggles of the drug depot. We see him in casual clothes, and he's thinking about how he can solve this issue. Even if the 4 of them were to collect herbs non-stop, they still wouldn't make it in time for 2 months. Taking into consideration that they have to endure all that training, it will really make it impossible. Chris walks into a pretty shady alleyway and sees 2 thugs and thinks to himself that it might be better to utilize the city's underground. The 2 thugs ask who the hell Chris thinks he is, and he introduces himself as a knight apprentice. He tells him that he's here to see their leader, but they just get into his face saying how they're gonna be nice right now if he goes and walks away. Chris scoffs at the 2 morons, saying how you're in control of this district but you don't know who I am? How do you even survive with such poor management? This gets its intended effect as one of the thugs winds his fist back to punch Chris. It's easily dodged, and Chris thinks it's been quite a while since he's last been in a fight. He gives a mean right hook to one of the thug's face that just sends him flying with teeth coming out of his mouth. Chris is pleasantly surprised by the power that he unleashed in just one punch. The second thug actually has a brain on his shoulders, seeing his friend get knocked the hell out, and decides to take Chris to his base. He tells him give him a second and he'll go talk to the boss, but Chris doesn't have that kind of time and just kicks the door open. He immediately says how it smells horrible in here, and then asks if this is Murdoch the hunting dog, the leader of these thugs. Do you ever clean this place up? Chris says, and Murdoch asks him to name himself, and Chris yet again tells him that he's Knight Apprentice Chris, and he's come here to bargain. Murdoch obviously didn't see what happened outside and tells his 8 henchmen to attack Chris. Chris gets his hands up and thinks that it's a good time for a scrap. These bozos charge in at Chris with various weapons, but he makes light work of the first man and bends downward to dodge an incoming kick. He sends a punch over his shoulder, knocking out the second moron, and bozo number 3 sweats a little, but still tries to strike back at Chris, but is instead greeted with a nice head kick. Thug number 4 tries to swing a wood object, but Chris breaks it with his hand, which makes the man quite confused, but the strike unveiled Chris's armor that he had covered under his clothes. The guy is sent into next week, and Murdoch is wondering what these idiots are doing. They can't even deal with a single kid. Murdoch apparently didn't get the memo and tries to punk Chris again, but misses. Chris uses his face as a stepping stone to launch to the air, and the man is now seen with a footprint on his face, and turns to see where Chris is going, but sees a shin flying to his face, which too knocks him unconscious. Some time passes, and Chris tells Murdoch to wake the hell up, and now we see all the other henchmen with their hands in the air, completely surrendered to Chris. Chris asks what kind of leader he is to wake up last, but Chris has a job for Murdoch. Collect some herds for me, it's not too bad, and if he does, he'll be paid handsomely. Chris returns to training camp, and now that he's dealt with the herb issue, we see the 3 boys running in despair. They yell for Chris, wondering if he's trying to get them killed. They can't take this anymore. Tykeel's the devil. Chris tells the boy that they did good today and he has somewhere to take them. He puts the 3 boys in the same herbal bath that he uses and says that all these herbs cost him his monthly salary. Ouch. Chris thanks the lady who changes the water in the bath, noting how hard it must be to change the water. He prepared a small gift for her, a potion, Pure Dream. If you apply it to your skin every day before bed, her skin will get clean and gentle. She's shocked and wonders how much this will cost her, and Chris replies saying that a single bottle costs 30 silver coins, which further shocks the lady who wonders how a small potion could be worth so much, and if it's really okay if she can use it. Chris says it's okay, but in exchange asks the maid to spread rumors of the potion among the noble servants, and every month he'll give her a bottle for free. Man, Chris is a businessman through and through. His plan is to use the money from selling the potions to provide a salary for Murdoch, which in turn creates a loop that pays for all the herbs he needs to collect, and therefore he'll be able to focus on training. The scene shifts and we see Chris laying in bed, wondering if she should just be a merchant instead. A mysterious blue cloud enters the room and Pumpkin barks to alert Chris. Before he can understand the situation, strange fumes get to him, causing Chris to become dizzy. He needs to work fast and take the antidotes just in case he was poisoned. This smells like sleeping powder, which is made of marine blue. The smell is too sharp. It was not created by a herbalist and it's probably from those incompetent bandits. 2 masked figures try to calm down Pumpkin, and Chris wonders how these men got into the camp. They turn to see Chris and throw a knife in his direction. They must have known where Chris's tent was. This had to be planned beforehand. Chris charges at one bandit with great speed and hits him with a devastating punch. The man is groaning and his comrade asks if he's okay, and Chris asks the 2 if they are insolent enough to attack a knight apprentice inside a military camp. Leave here immediately. The 2 start to run and Chris asks Pumpkin to lead the way. The 2 bandits are running back, confused on how Chris was still awake. That much sleeping powder should have kept him down for 2 days. Before they can finish the thought, Chris appears behind them with Pumpkin. The sweat is visible on the bandit's face, and they are confused on how they followed him all the way here. Chris clenches his fist and asks to bring their leader to him now. The 2 men are frozen in fear, but Chris just stands there firm with his arms crossed, asking these 2 morons what they are doing. Time is money, you know. Bring their leader here now. The 2 are still confused on what to do, but another red-haired man approaches asking what is going on. The 2 bandits turn to him, but he strikes one of them down for their failure, which shocks Chris. This man turns to Chris and apologizes if his subordinates caused him trouble. It was nothing personal. Chris asks why he was targeted, and he tells him that the reason is the recipe for Pure Dream, and if he answers his question, he can leave now. Bro, he's not gonna leave after you tried to assassinate him. Chris assumes that the criminal ringleader is the illegitimate son, and the man turns around again, interested in what Chris just said. And the soldiers who attack Chris are part of Back Dagger. So this is the so-called Back Dagger guild. But as soon as those words left his mouth, in an instant he was surrounded by many cloaked figures. The man asks Chris what he wants, and he responds asking for their leader. The man says that he is responsible for the Back Dagger, but Chris can't trust this information. But there's only one way to find out. Chris throws a pouch of money towards the man and asks him to make a bet. He tells the man that there's 50 gold coins in that bag, and he wants Back Dagger to come under Chris's command. One of the hooded figures asks if he's crazy, but the leader has a serious look and inquires on the condition of the bet. Chris tells him that they will duel with a single dagger, and the leader smiles. The 2 lock eyes and begin the duel. They circle around the arena, and Chris notices some holes dug in the ground. The leader has a wicked gaze and throws a dagger at Chris while he's off balance, but Chris catches the dagger and does a spin in midair and hits return to sender, launching the dagger with incredible full speed. The dagger pierces the leg of the bandit leader, and Chris gets another level up in his throwing skill, and he tells the man that that dagger wound must be quite painful. The leader is now infuriated and orders his men to kill Chris, and Chris tells Pumpkin to stay close as the horde of assassins descend on the duo. A loud shout is heard, screaming at the men, "Enough!" Chris is happy that the man behind the voice is finally here, and now we see the true leader is Guen. He greets Chris and invites him inside the tent. He orders the men that we previously thought was the leader to clean up this mess, which he agrees promptly. Chris compliments Guen's hideout, and he responds saying how Chris sure took his time, seeing how they promised to meet up right after the battle. Chris said that he had a lot of matters to take care of, and Guen adds that he never told Chris his name, but it seems that he already knew. I mean, well, Chris is a goddamn cheater. He lies saying how it was about his connections. Isn't that right, illegitimate son? Guen questions if Chris is being taught by the royal guard, which I guess he's referring to Taikil. Chris nods saying how it's quite expensive, but Chris asks Guen how he found out about Pure Dream. Do you have some info on that? But Guen tells him that that was a request from a merchant called Zarin, and he has no connection to the attack. Anyways, good luck with managing Back Dagger. What? Which catches Chris off guard too. You won the bet, didn't you? Are you not confident of yourself? Chris laughs this off, and the two walk outside. Guen informs the men that from this day forward, Chris is the guild master of Back Dagger. Wait, for real? Just like that? Man, Chris, you're not even hiding your plot armor. Guen takes his leave, and the man from before introduces himself as Fox, and he is Back Dagger's second in command. But his expression hints that he doesn't yet accept a 15-year-old boy as their leader. Chris has his first order for Fox and tells him to bring him the merchant Zarin here tomorrow evening. How the fuck did our boy just become the guildmaster for a bunch of assassins? This is getting crazy. The next day comes and we see Chris talking with Taikil in the training grounds, asking how his boys are doing. Taikil says Chris can see for himself, and in contrast for the first days of training, the three are now running with unmatched look of determination. Taikil tells Chris to come close and drops his staff. If you lose your weapon during a battle, what will you do? Chris answers saying how he'll just pick up another one, but Taikil breaks the spear on the ground and tells him, what if you don't have the opportunity? Chris thinks and answers saying he'll use his body as a weapon, which makes Taikil smile at the correct answer. And starting today, he will teach him taijutsu. Chris excitedly agrees, and Taikil is a little confused, saying how people are usually disappointed in mastering taijutsu. But Chris responds saying that he would be disappointed if he was placed in the same row as everyone else. Now, Chris thinks to himself that this situation is perfect. He has a flashback to when Lin told him that the period with no interventions will last for at least 2 years. And if the future changed, he managed to gain about a year or two. And in this time, Chris will get everything that he needs. We shift back to the Back Dagger camp, and Fox is mixing some herbs, still wondering on how on earth Guen let Chris become their leader. And even wonders how Chris's bottle is worth 30 silver coins. They bring Zarin, chained up and blindfolded, and send him into the basement. They remove the bandages from his mouth, and he yells to spare him, and he'll do anything. Anything, you say? The man begs for his life, just tell him what he needs to do. Fox tells him from now on, never mention Knight Apprentice Chris' name anywhere. The man asks if there's anything else, and Chris appears walking down the stairs and asks how everything is going. He informs Chris that he promised to never mention his name again, and if they should just let him go now. Chris thinks if they let him go now, there's going to be trouble later. Fox's men untie his arms, and as Zarin unties his blindfold, Chris tells the man to hold on. He tells Zarin that if he removes his blindfold, he will see his face, and then Chris will have to kill him. Is he okay with that? The man obviously isn't and starts sweating profusely and kneels towards the floor. Chris pulls up a chair and he begins to question Zarin. Was it his idea to assassinate Knight Apprentice Chris? Zarin stutters, saying that it wasn't him and he was only ordered to get the recipe for Pure Dream. Chris orders his men to cut off Zarin's tongue, which shocks everybody. But come on guys, you're an assassin guild. This should be like eating breakfast. The two men are prepared to cut off Zarin's tongue, but he pleads, saying that the order was given by him. He ordered the assassination of Chris. Chris now has this terrifying stare and orders his men to break one of his fingers. The man screams in agony, but at least he has his tongue. Chris reminds Zarin to answer his next question very carefully. What name are you supposed to forget? Chris! Chris! Looks like one finger wasn't enough. Please give me another chance, Zarin cries out. This is your last chance, Zarin. Whose name are you supposed to forget? I don't know who you're talking about, Zarin answers. Good, you're not a merchant for nothing, Chris says. He leans in close and whispers into Zarin's ear. We are Back Dagger, the shadow of Daybed. If you interfere with our blades, we will target your dear third daughter that you are so proud of. Chris leaves the man and orders to let him go, and he tells Fox to come with him. Chris hands Fox the recipe for Pure Dream and says he'll teach him when the time is right. Fox is confused on why Chris is giving him something this important, and Chris responds saying how he smells the scent of herbs from Fox, and he also has some powder under his fingernails. He further asks if the sleep drug was created by him. Chris plans to increase production of Pure Dream, and it seems Back Dagger has a herb specialist. Fox finally understands Guen wouldn't just pass his title to just anybody. Nighttime comes, and Zarin is depressed in bed. I mean, he did have a long day. His third daughter sings and comes into the room and wants to tell him about the perfect candidate she's found to marry. She's found a wonderful man at the inn and she can't get him out of his head. Knight Apprentice Chris is the one destined to be her husband after all. This made me laugh so hard. I mean, look at Zarin's reaction. Zarin starts to tear up and his daughter's confused on why he's responding like this. He just asks her to leave him alone. I mean, seriously, look at his finger. The next day comes and Chris is asked to come out of his tent. Knight Apprentice McCoy introduces himself and says Chris is being called and to follow him. Chris asks who sent him, but the other boy just gets in his face, calling him a peasant, and don't speak to him informally. Chris basically says, relax bro, we're the same rank, and the man steps off saying if it wasn't for his orders, he would have torn Chris apart. Sure buddy, sure you would. Chris follows and the boy leads him into a castle, and Chris continues to wonder on who called him. The boy tells Chris to go in and we see an assortment of delicious foods prepared on a long table. Chris steps inside and is greeted by the third Oda, who laughs saying, Chris, it's been a long time since they last spoke. He asks him to sit down, and this wine was delivered from Highguard. It's sweet and fades on the tongue. As both men have their glasses filled, Chris is a little freaked out by Wei-Hain's weird outfit, and asks the reason why he was summoned. Wei-Hain sips from his glass and tells Chris not to rush. He invited him for some small talk. He continues to go on listing the many achievements of our protagonists and even commenting on how it's quite a long list. But after some time, Wei-Hain realizes his stubbornness didn't let him see the whole picture. He gets to the point and asks Chris to come serve under him. If he wants to become a knight, he'll need to hear his wishes. If Chris carries on the family name, he will comfort him with tangled embraces. Embraces? What embraces, you weirdo? Chris thinks. Chris asks if Wei-Hain plans to promote Chris and grant him their family name for free without asking for anything in return. Wei-Hain starts doing a little feminine move on the tip of his wine glass and says Chris can return the generosity slowly, day by day. Chris thinks this sweet talk won't fool him. His attention is clear from his expressions. Chris appreciates the offer but wants to achieve these things because of his own abilities and thanks Wei-Hain for the delicious meal. Wei-Hain is now agitated and asks Chris if he will regret this decision. Chris tells him that he won't and he's long decided on the path that he'll take and decides to decline his offer. Wei-Hain tells him to leave and behind closed doors the third Oda is seething with anger. Chris is disgusted seeing the man's expression like he was just rejected. And I would be too, man. He wants to clap his cheeks. That's disgusting. The next day comes and Chris is called by Streak and is asked on what he's been up to lately. Streak orders Chris to go to Highguard in 2 days and tells Chris that he's gotten into some real shit this time. Chris was asked to protect the third prince and Lind wonders why the troublemaker decided to come here. Chris responds saying that apparently he wants to express his gratitude to the soldiers from the last battle. Lind says that he heard a rumor saying that the prince was once stung by a bee and punished his night guard by cutting off his arm. Lind and Chris look over the list of guards, but they don't see Lind's name, which makes the boy cheer in excitement. Fast forward and now we see Chris walking alone in the forest, noting how he has 2 days to prepare and find information. He assesses the situation and thinks that his mission won't be hard, and maybe Wei-Hain assigned him to this mission out of spite. Chris returns to the Back Dagger camp and is greeted by Fox and asks him what happened to his face. Chris scolds Fox and tells him that he should have brought the results of his experiment to him first. Fox thought he was confident in his calculations, but Chris changes the subject and asks Fox to look over the list and tell him if he sees anything suspicious. Fox browses over the list but sees nothing wrong. Chris further breaks it down and asks if there's anyone under Wei-Hain's direct command, but Fox responds no. Chris is in thought that the third prince might be a troublemaker, but his guards are lacking in number. These aren't even knight level guards. This situation is weird. It's almost as if they want something to happen. Chris orders Fox to dismiss everyone from their tasks and send all of the units to Highguard and Daybed to look for suspicious travelers. Fox says with the flow of people, it would be impossible to check everyone, but Chris states a condition. Only search for talented people of an advanced level. He also asks for caltrops and several metal wires. Chris is now seen conversing with Taikyo, and he also agrees that this guard duty seems like a problem. He asks Chris if he committed a crime, but he declines. Taikyo wonders why he wanted to see him. Chris asks about what he should do if he encounters an enemy stronger than he is. Taikyo says bluntly to just run away, and if I can't? Taikyo asks Chris to get to the point. Is there some kind of trump card? Taikyo responds that there is, and Chris is dazzling with excitement. When Taikyo responds that his trump card is regular and intense training, combined with battle experience. Chris is disappointed and reminds Taikyo that Ellis wants an interesting dad, not a boring stuffy one. Taikyo asks Chris what Ellis has to do with this and hands him a spear. He'll teach him some useful tricks. Chris wonders why Taikyo has a spear as well and regrets commenting on his daughter. Taikyo says he'll understand during the spar, and Chris reminds him that he cannot be injured before his mission. But Taikyo already knows that and just says to just begin. We now see Chris sitting at the table and one of his men give a report from his mission to inspect talented individuals. He hands Chris a report from High Guard saying that there's 5 skilled soldiers there and another 4 in daybed. So a squad of around 10, huh? Not enough to carry out an abduction. There must be something else. Chris needs to make preparations, and we fast forward to the mission that Chris was dreading. And to make matters worse, we have the same dumbass knight apprentice from before who is also looking annoyed to have to spend the day with Chris. He thinks that it's unfair that Chris has to lead them, but Chris just responds saying that he has to earn some achievement on the battlefield before he can talk. Chris orders his soldiers that it's time to depart for High Guard. The men are marching in 2 lines and complain about the hot weather. Chris notices something in the bushes and orders the squad to stop. Chris thinks he spotted a goblin. The annoyed knight apprentice from before thinks Chris is stupid, but from the bushes a swarm of goblins approaches. The men are shocked, but Chris calmly orders them to be ready to charge and exterminate the goblins. Surrounding them, they make quick work of the goblins, but wonder where they came from. The triangle is supposed to be a safe haven between the 3 major cities, and monsters are unlikely to attack within this territory. Chris is worried that this happened on the exact day of the escort squad. Chris orders his men to make a small stop, and Chris ventures into the woods and meets up with Pumpkin, who has blood all around his face. I guess he was busy hunting. I mean, he is a wolf after all. And Chris begins to set his traps, and he returns to camp. McCoy asks him what he was doing for so long as the commander, and Chris just lies, saying that he was so nervous he had to take a shit. McCoy is disgusted, but Chris informs everyone that it's time to move. Later in the day, Chris orders his men to be alert, since another group of goblins are there. They are easily dealt with, but the group notices that at this rate, they won't be able to arrive at High Guard before sunset. Chris orders the men to stop and rest for the night, but McCoy has a problem with this. But how can Chris ask all these men who risk their lives to march all night as well? McCoy says that they'll be risking their lives if they arrive late for the prince. Chris continues to annoy McCoy, saying how he seems to forget who's in charge here. Nighttime comes and the men are preparing to sleep, and McCoy wonders why they all have sleeping bags. Chris can only think that this man is unaware of how the world works. You need to be ready for anything. One of the soldiers offer their sleeping bag, but McCoy declines, and Chris jokingly tells him that he can share his. This infuriates him even more, and he even promises to kill Chris one day. The next day comes, and Chris orders the men to eat and get ready to march, and they soon arrive at High Guard. The guards shake Chris's hand and inquire on why they were so late. Chris informs them that they were stopped by some groups of goblins, which shocks the guards. Goblins in the triangle? Chris notes that they weren't big in number and maybe they were just scared away from their caves, and asks when the prince will arrive. Speaking of the devil, a carriage with the prince arrives. Chris bows and introduces himself as the leader of the escort squad. The young prince tells Chris to raise his head and wonders what Chris is staring at. Does he want him to gouge his eyes out? That's not very nice of him to stay after the first meeting. Chris has a nervous sweat and assumes that the rumors are true. We're introduced to the third prince, Eric Serrato Gauch, and he tells Chris that he's heard rumors about him, but he seems that he's really nothing special. The mayor of High Guard greets Chris and tells him that they made all the preparations to depart immediately, and Chris thinks that this guy is talking to him like they're removing a bomb from the city. Chris reorders his men to move out, and their destination is daybed. 2 of the soldiers start whispering, and one of them asks to resume the story the other was saying earlier. Before he can finish, however, the escort party is ambushed. Chris was expecting something like this and rushes to meet the enemy. He orders his men to hold their ground and the soldiers in the rear to protect the carriage, while the soldiers in the vanguard go to destroy the enemy. Chris is hacking and slashing down enemy assassins, and one of the men he hit is in awe of the weight behind his spear, questioning if it's made of steel. There are more enemies than Chris anticipated, and even Sir Nelson, the prince's knight, is struggling. 2 assassins lunge at Chris while he's thinking of a way to deal with the enemies, and the only thing for him to do is to go all out. We get a flashback of Chris's training with Taikyo, and he taught him a useful AoE ability that resembles a snake tongue, which we see Chris execute on the 2 assassins, cutting them up with ease. His spear looks like it's curving around his arm. We see a cry towards the prince, and one of the assassins has him with a blade to his neck. Chris turns and throws his spear into the chest of the man, freeing the prince, which leaves him speechless. Yeah, not so impressive, huh? But just then, another assassin approaches trying to kill the prince. Chris gets down into a position that resembles a track runner, and we get another flashback to Taikyo teaching him another technique that will help him land a devastating hit from this horse stance. We see Chris gather energy into his pivot foot and launch, leaving the ground with incredible speed. He zips faster than the eye can see and quickly handles the assassin about to kill the prince. This skill is called dash, and we see the enemy assassin die upon impact. Chris continues his assault, dealing with the assassins one by one, and he receives a cut to his arm, but his armor took the brunt of the blow. He smacks the assassin who hit him, and then Chris calls out for the prince's condition, but it doesn't look like he's having too much fun. Chris calls out to Nelson, informing him that he's going to take the prince and meet him at daybed. The assassins also hear this, but before they can pounce on the prince, Chris throws a smoke bomb and makes his escape. With the prince in Chris's arms, they make their getaway, and they meet Pumpkin, which startles the young lord. He notices that assassins are still on their trail, and Chris runs with Pumpkin by his side, passing the previous area where they fought the goblins. Chris throws another smoke bomb, baiting the assassins into the field of traps. One gets hit by the wires, which makes the others try to start cutting at them, but instead they fall into the caltrops. It halts their chase, giving Chris enough time to make some distance. The bandits begin to argue and send men to take their injured and leave the rest to continue the chase. One of the pursuers says, "What kind of dumbass brings caltrops on a mission? But why are you even asking that? Of course our boy did. He loves setting up morons in his traps." But now, Chris is unfortunately out of tricks, but Pumpkin turns to his pursuers. They try to kill the wolf, but it gathers fire in its mouth and lets out a wide cone of flame that decimates the assassins. I told you Pumpkin was OP. Chris tells the prince to sit for a break, but the prince is quite anxious about his pursuers. Chris says they'll just wait until he can check his bleeding, and the prince agrees. And Chris asks if he knows the way to daybed. Obviously he doesn't, and he thinks he's going to need to keep Chris around for his own safety. He politely asks Chris to escort him to daybed, which Chris humbly accepts, but just like that, 2 more assassins arrive. It seems like the amount that Chris can handle. See, Chris is a simple man. If he doesn't see a chance of winning, he runs. He takes off all his armor, covering his arms, and the soldiers are confused on what this guy is doing. Chris continues saying how this is probably a bad idea to fight without a weapon, but he still has the feeling that he's gonna win. This angers the 2 assassins, who immediately take their stances and point their blades at Chris. They lunge at him, but one is immediately met with a powerful kick, sending him flying. The second assassin is stunned seeing his friend fly on airline Chris, and in that moment of hesitation, Chris gives him a powerful punch to the stomach. The 2 are injured, but still conscious, but it appears they underestimated Chris. They are baffled that he spent half a day running with the prince in hand, wearing armor, but still has the energy to keep up speed in combat. Just who is this kid, they think? They realize now that his title of hero isn't just for show. They are no match for Chris. He is a monster. The 2 men exchange glances and then dart away. Seeing the futility in throwing their lives away, the prince is excited and curses the fools who try to attack a member of the royal family. Chris knows the employer of these assassins must be someone powerful and keeps him on edge. Ideally, he wanted to capture one for some intel, but he cannot risk the prince's life. The prince compliments Chris and notes that he might even be better than his soldiers. Chris keeps the humble guys, but thinks of the man responsible, but only one comes to mind. The Duke Roald Gauche. Now we see the 2 men return to Rados Ben, that same Duke's knight, to inform him of their failure. He can't believe his assassins failed because of one knight apprentice. If you want something done right, you need to do it yourself. Rados calls for his weapons and mask and clenches his fist in regrets for underestimating Chris. He's gonna need to go all out. The forest is covered in darkness, and Chris tells the prince that they should rest, instead of continuing on. The prince is anxious to get to a safe place and demands to know the reason. Chris explains that the enemy knew the time and place of his arrival. Isn't that weird? The prince doesn't follow. Then Chris continues. They launched their attack right when they left Highguard. No one knew you would arrive except for those who were in the royal family. He then asks the prince if he knows what would have happened if he stayed in Highguard. The prince then assumes that Van Ludwig is responsible, but Chris didn't mean to implicate him, because he's the one protecting these borders. Before Chris reveals who he thinks it is, he tells the prince that he has no evidence and this is just his personal assumption. The prince is getting impatient and tells Chris he won't punish the name of who Chris speaks. Chris smiles at the prince now caught on and continues his explanation. But the young lord is getting impatient and wants Chris just to get to the chase. Wehane Ludwig, the Baron's oldest son. He knew about everything and was even the one who assigned Chris to escort him. The prince thought that Chris was assigned because of his skills, but the escort party was not sufficient enough to be assigned this mission from the start. The prince thinks Chris is kidding since did you see what he just did back there? He just killed like 10 dudes. He's more than acceptable for his role. He promises Chris that he won't pursue Wehane in any way just yet, and he asks Chris if they'll stay here for the night. Chris tells him that he told Nelson they will arrive at daybed in the evening to throw off the enemy. Not everybody sleeps in the woods, so it will prevent them from running into other travelers. Chris's monologue is interrupted by the growl of the prince's stomach, so first things first, Chris is going to need to get something to eat. Chris lends the prince his sleeping bag and they chill around the fire, and the prince thanks Chris for saving him. Chris just smiles, saying how the prince is really a good guy after all. This is the first person to ever tell him something like that, and everyone else just shivers in fear. Chris tells him that they don't know what kind of person that he is, and the sympathetic nature that he has. The prince is flustered at what Chris said, but Pumpkin soon arrives. Chris pets his wolf companion and asks him where he learned that fire move, and not to do it again without his command. He barks in agreement, but Chris tells him to keep quiet since the prince is fast asleep. Chris leans in a tree, watching over the sleeping prince, and thinks that his throwing skill is at 49 points, and something must happen at 50. Chris has been taking notes of his reaction when his throwing skill was at 40. compared to 30. And a flashback shows Taikil smacking Chris on the head. Chris seems to be stuck on a topic that Taikil is trying to teach him. It's hard to learn in one day, but if he can understand it, will he succeed? Taikil agrees, but tells Chris it's time to fight with swords. Chris protests because of his upcoming mission, but Taikil gets serious. Most knights die in vain. Are you that eager to meet your ancestors, Chris? If not, watch carefully. Intuition can save you from a stray blade. Your sword cannot. The opponent's breathing, the voice movements, the sound of their sword cutting through the air. Feel everything. And Taikil swings on Chris, but he blocks it with his arm. Do not block. Dodge. You never know what kind of weapon you will be hit with again. Taikil thinks to himself that the boy has talent despite his age and his amazing reflexes. His intuition is sharp and even thinks that he would have to die once to improve to this extent. Well bro, you're not that far off. Taikil says that this is the last repetition and Chris closes his eyes and feels a blade slice his shoulder and dodges backwards. A sweat drips from his face. What was that? This is Saugi, or Killing Intent, one of the skills every true knight possesses. Killing Intent is the energy that shows one's determination to kill their opponent. Taikil never even moved. How does it feel, Chris? Everyone interprets Saugi different. In Taikil's case, he differentiates the enemy's breathing. Chris doesn't fully understand, but he feels a sword out of nowhere like he's being cut. You don't have to learn it right away. Comprehension comes with experience. Back to the present, Chris is immediately awoken by a wave of killing intent. You sense Saugi at your age? Rado says. Chris is worried on the strong energy that he's feeling, and his only weapon is a short sword, and he isn't confident that he can win. This guy even has wise. Rados, in a similar outfit to the previous assassin, stands ominously in front of Chris and Pumpkin. Chris orders the wolf to protect the prince and tells the two to run straight into the forest. The prince is confused since it's only one guy, so what's the big deal? But Chris screams, "Run, now! This guy is not the same as the ones before. Hurry!" The man yells at the prince, saying if he tries to run, he's gonna cut his legs off, causing the boy to fall in fear. The situation is looking bleak. The Baron must be involved for a soldier of wise to be sent to kill the prince. Chris staggers back. What do I do now, he thinks. Rados curses the boy for looking away during a fight and lunges at him, sword in hand, ready to kill him. But just then, out of nowhere, Guen blocks a strike. This guy is the best timing, I swear. Rados is shocked at his arrival. So you get scared too, huh, Chris? Guen says calmly. Guen greets the prince and introduces himself as a soldier of Baron Van Ludwig. He apologizes for this tactless greeting, but he's gonna save them from this assassin. Fox, dressed as an ordinary soldier, looks towards Chris, but Guen signals the two to stay back and protect the prince. Guen hands Chris his scabbard and tells him not to lose it. It costs more than his life. He looks towards the assassin and notices that the two are quite alike and understand each other's power. They brace and charge in headfirst into one another. The clash of their swords creates great shockwaves around them. So many strikes and slashes at once, it's hard for an ordinary person's eyes to keep up. They are trying to count the amount of hits per second, but each one sends a powerful gust of wind past them. Chris, just by watching, is increasing his swordsmanship as the prompt says that it raised to 52. So this is a battle of wise. In this fight, Guen thinks he's stronger, but speed can go both ways. He's confident that he can win in a drawn-out battle. However, the two separate and gaze on each other intently. Rados, with lightning enveloping his figure, sends a strike towards Guen, which is blocked. As the two men lock swords, Guen gets the upper hand and breaks Rados' weapon in two. Without a weapon and a torn mask, Rados needs to retreat since he's failed his mission. Guen orders his men to give chase and Chris returns the scabbard. Costs more than my life, huh? The prince is in the back of Fox and Wehane greets the group. He's so happy that he's safe and sound. From now on, the prince will be protected by Van Ludwig's personal knight squad. Who the hell are you? The prince asks, and Wehane introduces himself. The prince smiles. Wehane, you say? He is then escorted to the carriage and he waves goodbye to Knight Apprentice Chris with a smile on his face. And Chris and Wehane lock eyes. Wehane is slightly annoyed, you could say. Chris is relieved to be back in his tent next to Pumpkin. No place like home. And the next morning comes, and Chris is already ordered to step outside. McCoy is calling him and Chris wonders what's going on, but soon handcuffs are slapped on his wrist. McCoy relays the order to arrest Knight Apprentice Chris for being a suspect of assassination. What? What in the politics is going on right now? Chris is being escorted and can't believe he was cuffed just like that. This situation is bad. They've pushed all the responsibility onto him. This is a perfect opportunity to make Chris fall in line. Is Wehane behind this? Doki looks towards the men with rage visible on his face. He tells his boys to calm down and he's going to be back soon. They arrive at court and McCoy apologizes. He tells Chris that there's nothing he can do. Wow, he actually feels bad. Seems like he likes her war a little bit. Bonus points for McCoy. Are you worrying about me, McCoy? Chris says mockingly. Behind his smile, he is indeed worried. Chris arrives in the hall with groups of men sitting around 3 tables. Even the Baron is present. They begin the trial and the Baron tells Wehane to give a complete explanation. He begins saying that the Baron's knight squad saved the third prince and finished the mission, but something felt off. The enemy shouldn't have been able to infiltrate the triangle without being spotted. Wei-Hein assumes that their traitor is among them. In this given situation, he finds Knight Apprentice Chris's actions extremely suspicious. Even though he's an apprentice, he stays at the barracks and visits the city often. He's also seen in the company of lowlifes and visits an unknown man's house frequently. Chris is concerned that they have this much intel on him. Wei-Hein is convinced that Chris cooperated with the spies in the army and planned this incident. He put a member of the royal family in danger. Chris can only think that this guy is full of shit. The Baron orders Chris to give the identity of the unknown man. Chris, under pressure, thinks that he should just stick with the truth. The unknown man is former Royal Guard Knight Tykiel. Ludwig is familiar with him. Keep him out of the investigation, he says. One of the men on the board asks what reason Chris had to plan this incident. Wei-Hein responds saying that it's simple. He wants to prove his reputation by saving the third prince. He is eager to climb the ranks. Chris knows that this was planned very carefully by Wei-Hein. He's even prepared counter-arguments. The truth doesn't matter here, it's all for show. They are toying with him. Execution probably isn't in the cards, but Chris can't stand to lose everything that he's achieved. A rumble can be heard outside the door, and the third prince barges in. His face looks a little stuffed. I think he had a good meal. He greets Chris and notices his desperate situation. The third prince wants to be a part of this trial as well. Any objections? There are not, and the prince takes his seat. He immediately shouts that Chris is innocent. Wei-Hein has a stressed look on his face and continues saying not to let the boy blind his judgment. He just wants to gain your favor. But again, like a boss with his feet on the table, Prince says that this is all BS, and once again, Chris is innocent. Wei-Hein tries to argue, but the prince asks where the hell Wei-Hein was when he was being attacked and chased in the woods. It was Chris who saved him. And now they're trying to execute him? Wei-Hein is visibly upset, and before he can say anything, the prince orders Nelson to gouge his eyes out. He looked at me aggressively. My life feels threatened. Man, I'm starting to really like the prince. What are you doing, Nelson? Gouge his eyes out. Nelson reaches for his sword a little anxiously because he doesn't want to commit the act. Wei-Hein cries for his father, and the Baron says there seems to be a misunderstanding. His son would never have ill intentions towards the prince. He continues that his judgment is correct. Chris is in fact innocent. In the next panel, we see Chris and the prince sitting side by side, laughing at Wei-Hein's expression during the trial. It's a pity they didn't push him a little bit farther, and they probably could have seen him shit his pants. The prince tells Chris to continue his story on how he earned the Medal of Honor, and Chris reenacts the actions of the day on the battlefield, and the prince is in awe of his skill and praises Chris. The prince urges him to get right to the main topic, and Chris is a little confused on what he means. Come with me to the capital, the prince says, which puts a puzzled expression on our protagonist's face. Chris is lost for words, but the prince says that even Nelson likes the idea. Does the prince really like me that much to go with him to the capital? If he does this now, it will withhold Chris from earning even more achievements on the battlefield, but he can't get on the prince's bad side. Chris asks to tell a story and the prince agrees. Chris takes a deep breath and tells the story of the first time he was on a battlefield. His good friend Drans stood right next to him. He lost both of his legs in the battle and died in Chris's arms. It's hard for him to abandon this place right now. The prince tears up and Chris changes the conversation and asks him if he thinks the 8 gates is a pain in the ass. The prince wipes away his tears. Of course I do. Isn't it obvious? Chris gets on one knee. Give me 3 years and I will conquer the 8-gate stronghold Wolf's Den in your name. Really? For me? Chris promises the young lord it'll be done and vows. The prince has faith in him and asks him if there's anything that he needs. I want to reward you with something in my means. Since he's asking, we don't see what Chris really asked for, but the prince seems mildly disappointed. But this is more than enough for Chris. Chris leaves and is relieved he found a way out of that mess, but there's still much to do. He still remembers the fight with Guen and Rados. He's still not on that level. If Guen wasn't there, Rados surely would have killed Chris. He needs to become faster and stronger, and needs to master the power of Wise. Chris arrives back at his tent and overhears his boys arguing on how they're gonna save him. Chris enters and asks what these doofuses are planning. To rescue me, huh? You don't fear the Baron's forces, just the 3 of you? Lind, who knew you were so brave to come up with a plan like this? Lind diverts the blame, saying how it was all Doki's plan. Yeah, the guy who has 4 lines in the entire story. Good one. The boys begin to argue and Chris bursts out in laughter. What is this feeling? That's right, there's no rush. Chris is not alone. He has allies who would die for him. He hugs the boys and thanks them. He feels much better now. Lin definitely thinks he hurt his head on that last mission. Chris dismisses this remark and says that all the drinks tonight are on him. The boys are drinking and Ellis is in, and she inquires on what happened at court. Chris was proven innocent and asks Ellis if she found her preferred weapon. She responds saying how she's going to use a rapier since it suits her. Doki chimes in saying how a skinny sword doesn't suit her, but Ellis argues that he's just a drunk. And then the two agree to a drink-off with Lind as a referee. Ellis is seen as the winner, as Doki is slumped on a table. Ellis is becoming a fan favorite too. The next day comes and the boys continue their training. Taikyo works them hard and tells them whoever is last is going to get more work. The story fast forwards to 3 months later, and we see the boys doing their herbal baths once again. We can assume that the boys kept up the same routine every day for the past 3 months. Chris closes his eyes and reminisces on his old life, where his old comrade told him that Wise has 9 stages. In the flashback, the man continues saying that there's a lot of information uncovered about it, and there's several training methods. Do you know them, Chris? Chris, at the time, only knew the basic method where Wise is passed down through generations. This is the first method in the so-called 9-floored tower. Researchers divided the comprehension of Wise in 9 stages. If a kid passes the first stage, he will be comparable to an adult. However, Chris won't be able to master it. Why? Because I only have 1 arm? No, he says, because you're too old to master Wise. It's not a matter of age, actually, but one needs a body with a special structure. The fundamental training of Wise is being able to absorb mana that flows around you. In simple terms, the first step is feeling the mana with your body. Back to the present, Chris clenches his fist excitedly. He's got it. Lynn is confused but doesn't know that Chris just unlocked Wise. Fast forward, and now Chris is out of the camp and a soldier informs him that someone from Central Shed is looking for him. Chris thinks that he was sent by the prince and he comes right on time. The man introduces himself as Sick Million from Central Shed. Chris shakes his hand and asks where the book is. The man just shakes his head nervously. Unfortunately, it's prohibited from exporting that book, but instead he came himself. Chris is a little disappointed and asks what he means. Sick says that he's been studying the 9-floored tower and the strike of arrows for 10 years and reintroduces himself as a researcher from Central Shed, and he's researching methods to comprehend Wise. Sick Million? This is the first time Chris has ever heard of such a man. Sick excitedly states that there isn't too many people focused on the basics, but Chris believes that a foundation is the most crucial part. Sick is delighted by this response and gives an analogy saying that in order to forge a good sword, you first need good quality steel. Mastering the basics provides the best conditions for perfect training, a way to allow the comprehension of the origins, Chris says. Sick is further impressed by our boy, and after this conversation, Chris recalls just who in fact this man is. He is the original author of a book from his past life, The Basic Method to Awaken Wise. We are shown a flashback where Chris learns that unlocking Wise is time sensitive, and the author of the book that he was reading was Sick himself. Now we see Chris conversing with Streak asking for a vacation, but Streak can only agree since Chris now has the backing of the third prince. He says that it's fine as long as the drug depot is in order. Chris is now seen talking to Taikyo, who asks Chris if it's really possible. Chris is explaining the herbal baths and the methods to unlock Wise to Taikyo. Taikyo finally understands how the boys were recovering so quickly. Chris asks the man's permission to include Ellis in the Wise activation training, which he agrees. Ellis walks into the inn and expresses her desire to become stronger. The only reason why Taikyo is fine with this is because Chris is the testing dummy. And back at the tent, Chris is meditating on his control of flowing mana, and he thinks back to Sick informing him that just being able to absorb mana does not mean you can use Wise. One can comprehend Wise after 2 stages. The first is the seal, and the second is awakening. In order to create a seal, first you need to control the mana around you. Once you succeed in drawing a circle of mana in the air or gathering dispersed mana into one place, a symbol will appear on a part of your body. That is the seal. Chris experiments trying to conduct mana between his fingers, but is unable to control the flow. 4 weeks pass by and the boys are sweating from their daily training, reminiscing on the passing month. The boys wonder if they feel mana yet, which Chris instructed them to tell him if they did. Toki just wonders if mana is edible, and that's just typical for his character. The scene shifts to Baron Van Ludwig coughing up blood into a handkerchief, foreshadowing that his life doesn't have long left. Guen is by his side and the Baron asks where Weihane is, and Guen informs him that he returned from a mission in Highguard. The situation is dire. An heir needs to be appointed. Weihane is indecisive and weak, and his second son Molt is only interested in fine arts. The Baron thinks if only Guen was a legitimate son. The Baron asks Guen to swear an oath of loyalty to Weihane, which shocks the man. He needs you, Guen. Can you do that for me? Guen responds yes, and another voice is heard entering the room. Weihane yells at Guen to leave the room like a dickhead that he is, and the Baron asks him to keep his promise. A soldier bursts into the room, saying that there is trouble. Back at Chris's tent, he managed to create a mana circle with his finger. The next step is getting his seal. Sick explained that a seal's image depicts different abilities based on the symbol. The benefit of the 9-floored tower is sustainability. There is another way to comprehend Wise called the strike of the arrow, and don't ask me what that means, they didn't explain it yet. Chris interrupts the man and asks if there's a way to fuse the 2 methods into one. Sick is perplexed and doesn't recall an event of this happening. Chris asked this because in his previous life there was many ways to train Wise, meaning that there's still a lot lot of information that's undiscovered. Chris will be taking a huge risk, but without risk, there is no success. Chris will try to combine the two symbols, and even if he fails, his efforts will not be wasted. He begins channeling mana into his foot, noticing the high temperature that he's feeling. A circular symbol appears on his foot with a 5 stack of bricks in the shape of a wall. He did it! A prompt shows that his wise comprehension has increased to level 10. He goes excitedly to Taikil to tell him the news, and he notices that Chris has a similar aura to other wise users. A soldier arrives on horseback calling for Chris with an urgent order for all troops to assemble. The 8 Gates is invading. It's an all-out war. Typical plot armor timing for Chris to get Super Saiyan right before a huge war, but I mean, I'm excited for it. Chris accepts the order and moves out. Ellis wants to come, but she isn't exactly in the army, so she really can't. Chris prepared herbs for the baths and told the girl to continue her training. Chris leaves for the battlefield, but notes how things are progressing faster than he expected, and it's not going to plan. Chris runs past the homeless man and throws a coin in his bowl. The man sees the shape of a coin and understands that this signals emergency for Back Dagger members and begins to run off. Chris meets up with Lind and inquires on the situation. Zerk was invaded much faster than before. Chris thinks that they used a certain strategy too early, and from what I can understand, they might be doing something to their horses or have a special breed to them. There's no time to waste, and Chris orders Pumpkin to take him to a certain spot where the battle has already taken place. 3 recon squads have been wiped out, and a single knight is seen chopping the heads of 2 soldiers in one blow. We now see the same knight at the 8 Gates tactical camp informing his commander of his achievement, as expected of the highest class knight, Rinian Wolves. A gray-haired man informs the bunch that he's ready for his first mission. The Baron's Triangle may be heavily defended, but the surrounding territories are weak. They will burn every village in their wake in the name of this operation. It's called Rampant Massacre. That's more like an action, not a code name. You're just describing what you're gonna do. Anyways, Chris arrives with a battalion to Fort Sunset Hide, and Chris's past life, the enemy broke through these thick walls, but this time, the outcome will be different. The soldiers are called to formation, and Baron Van Ludwig stands fully armored, ready to speak to his troops. Chris wonders how this man could be on the verge of death, but he begins to speak. These walls have protected our lands for 3 generations, and no enemy has ever passed them. Yet another foe will try again. There is no need for a long speech. We will crush our enemies. The 8 Gate troops attack the first village, but find that it's empty. The wells have been filled with dirt, and they won't be able to use to power their meat. And without water, it's going to make it harder to advance. There's nothing to gain from this village, so the troops head out to search for the next one. Another squad runs into them. All of the surrounding villages appear to be in the same state, giving the 8 Gate troops no opportunities to gain resources. They are perplexed on how the villagers left their homes so quickly. They get a message saying that one village has 2 wells that are untouched. Chris starts using his seal technique on Digo, which levels up his wise comprehension to 15. He then does this for all the boys and instructs them to develop their seals. A cloaked fox informs Chris that they finished their task. They used a lot of gold from the Pure Dream operation to bribe the villagers to abandon their homes. It seems Chris was behind all the village's sabotage. They left 2 wells untouched by Chris's request, so they know the location of the enemy. Chris is a freaking genius, what the hell? All his preparations are done and it's time to make his move. Chris approaches the Baron's tent and a guard yells asking who Chris thinks he is, but the Baron tells the moron to just let him in. Chris kneels and greets the Baron, but the Baron just asks the boy to speak. Chris boldly states that if he assigns him 100 cavalrymen, he will crush the enemy reconnaissance squads. Wehane starts bashing Chris, but the Baron's guards order him to stop, which scares the hell out of Wehane. The Baron thinks Chris is quite confident and approves under the condition that if he fails, he's gonna take Chris's head. Chris has no objections and leaves the tent, and Wehane wonders why his father just let this kid take 100 cavalrymen. It's too big of a responsibility for a boy. The Baron, however, sees Chris's upside potential, and if he succeeds, it'll be a huge factor in the war, and if he doesn't, it'll be low risk and they'll only lose 100 men. Chris is determined to win no matter what. Chris and Lin lead the forces, and Chris wonders where Lin learned to ride a horse like that. He picked it up recently at the camp, but is still not too good at it. They order the troops to stop, and the troops start to gossip about Chris and Pumpkin. It seems they don't recognize their team commander just yet. They even start talking shit about Pumpkin, which that's going over the line. They gotta be careful. They look over the ridge and analyze the terrain, and Chris notes the shore is ahead. The enemy will arrive soon, and if he was the enemy commander, what would he do in this kind of situation? Chris thinks the best move is to set traps and divide the enemy, and set out spies to scout further ahead. And as soon as he thinks this, Lin sees the enemy with his hawk eyes, just as Chris predicted. Around 200 enemy soldiers are below them in the ridge. One of the soldiers questions Chris, saying how hundreds of reconnaissance squads died already. Does he really plan on advancing further? Chris just wonders if his squad is full of morons, and this guy is even questioning the map that Chris is looking at. Chris is using a map that he made for Herbs that shows the topographic features of the area, but he doesn't want to sit there and explain his plan. He tells the man to just shut up and accept his orders. Insubordination won't be tolerated. Another one of the soldiers tries to calm the man down. Chris must know what he's doing, right? Being a commander must be hard, huh? Lin says. But at least there's always a bright side. Chris feels a strange vibration in his foot, and his wise comprehension levels up to 21. A change is happening in Chris's body. He can feel the mana more clearly. He's awakened. Chris takes his men to the ridge and orders them to prepare for battle. The soldiers ask where Chris is going. He's going to attack the enemy's rear and will assist if problems arise. He orders Lin to continue the plan, and the same curious bearded man asks if it's a good idea to leave them like this. What if there's nothing in the rear? Chris elaborates that the enemy has scouted the terrain and established an escape route, and if there's nothing in the rear, they will simply attack the enemy from behind. They will have to trust the others until they return. What's important now is to be confident in their victory. Chris asks Digo why he's spacing out, and no matter how much he's practicing wise, he still can't seem to get his head around it. Chris says that Digo won't die today, with a smile on his face. Back at the 8 Gates camp, the soldiers are lamenting eating the powdered meat again, and also how much of a pain in the ass their fast horses are to take care of. Pumpkin approaches one of the horses with fire emanating from his mouth. A soldier awakes his commander, telling him how a wolf is scaring all their horses. The commander can't believe this man can't deal with this kind of stuff by himself. But sir, the wolf breathes fire. Now, the commander is alert. It really does breathe fire. What is that thing? The soldiers are a little confused on what to do, but think a wolf should just be like a stupid mutt, so they should just capture it. They assemble the men to capture Pumpkin, but he's really elusive and escapes. They give chase, and the soldiers notice the Zerk forces are in their escape route. They forget about the wolf and order the men to attack the stupid Zerks. The 8 Gate soldiers approach, ready to attack, and Chris and Digo wait in the bushes. There's over 20 men. Are we really going to be able to win? Chris just tells Digo to be confident in swinging his poleaxe. He is the strongest of them after all. The 8 Gate soldiers continue the charge, thinking that this will be easy. But the men at the rear begin to scream. Digo starts chopping men literally in half, almost like butter, and is shocked at his own strength. Surprised on how far he's really gotten. Doki is rampaging through the enemy with dual axes, and the soldiers at the rear are in fear. What is going on? They look at Chris. It's impossible to think that this is a mere child. Impossible. This kind of talk just hurts Chris's ears, as he gives the man something to think about by removing his head from his shoulders. They don't know how hard Chris and the boys have worked to get this power. They finish off the enemy and think that they were pretty weak. But Chris tells them that they're not weak, the boys are just strong. Doki raises his axes. Be strong. Nice. Back at the main forces, the enemy won't go down so easily, and both sides are sustaining casualties. One of the men thrusts his spear through an 8 Gate cavalryman and thinks the enemy just won't stop coming. No matter how many he kills, they just keep appearing. They need to clear a path. This squad is made of outcasts and troublemakers. They can't hope to receive any reinforcements. The man thinks the boyish commander has already abandoned them, as more enemy units converge from the left side. The terrain is not to their advantage, since the enemy has the more mobile horses. As soon as he curses his luck, an arrow flies into the head of the incoming soldier. The enemy scrambles to identify where that archer just shot from, and the Zerk soldiers scream, wondering if this is their reinforcements. But see Lin atop the hill, sniping people one by one like a savage. Lin jumps down from the ridge, and we see a flashback where Lin is talking to Taikil. He feels that he'll never catch up to Chris, and compared to Digo and Doki, he's lacking behind. Taikil tells him to pick up a bow and follow him. Lin hits the bullseye from a ways away, and Taikil says the boy does have potential. Though it is true, he is lacking something. He lacks power. But on the battlefield, there are many unknown variables, like a sneak attack or a gust of wind. Taikil pulls back the bowstring with some absolutely jacked forearms. These situations are provided to not lose an opportunity to bring an opponent down in a single strike. He lets off the bow, firing a shot, and tells Lin not to compare himself to others. His success depends only on him. If you're scared, go back and get your spear. Back in the present, Lin thanks Taikil for his advice, and he continues to use his skill with the bow to chip away at the enemy. Back in the flashback, Taikil tells Lin that he knows he's not stupid enough to grab a spear when he has such keen eyes. Lin thanks Taikil for giving him the courage that he needs as he dinks another soldier. He might have a care package by now, he's on a husky kill streak. The soldiers are in disarray, trying to steal each other's shields, but another soldier is sniped. The last man covers his face, but Lin fits the arrow on a thread right in the opening in his face mask. killing this man as well. Lind won't let anyone escape. The Zerk infantry is fighting hard, but doesn't see an end to the wave of soldiers. The man tells the other soldier that they're going to need to buy some time. There isn't many enemies remaining, but reality sets in for the bearded man. He might just die here today. Is this the end, Zipper? As they drift into despair, Chris comes riding by with an enemy horse and yells at the two to get out of his way. They're going to handle the front line. The enemy's rear has been destroyed. Only these losers remain, and the two depressed soldiers realize that they're on the verge of winning. Chris, Digo, and Doki continue the assault, slicing enemies down effortlessly. Digo is still chopping people in half and making it look easy. I mean, what the hell is his workout plan? I'm gonna need to get on that. Lind arrives and follows Chris, and the once talkative bearded man from before is in awe of the boy's talent. Lind looks at him and just smiles, saying how, so you survived after all. You did well. Lind tells Chris that the enemy has regrouped and is charging at them again. Chris tells his troop to listen up. The enemy has very mobile horses. Form into 2 lanes for us not to get surrounded. They will face the enemy right away. The tired soldiers ask if they really plan to charge again, and Chris just tells them, what, are you afraid we're gonna lose? At the 8 Gates Intelligence HQ, a soldier informs the man that the reconnaissance squad has been destroyed, which shocks the commander. And the messenger continues, saying how the Zerk sent a powerful soldier that is knight level. Is this a member of Ludwig's personal squad? Just how strong is this man? The messenger goes on saying how his skills even rival an intermediate knight, but he's very young. Wait a minute, very young you say? We see the similar commander with a scar on his head that Chris originally fought and destroyed most of his unit. Was it a brat with dark blue hair? He says menacingly. It seems he wants some payback. Back at the battle, the Zerks clean up the remaining forces, and the 2 soldiers who question Chris kneel in front of him. They apologize for their earlier rudeness. Chris says that it's just all good, and it's not the first time he's been judged based on his appearance. The first man introduces himself as Slithy Hannel. He was the previous commander of this squad, and the bearded man is named Sephoro. He was the second in command. Chris orders the 2 to assemble everyone they have. There's matters to discuss. The troops gather in front of Chris, and he shows off one of the red-haired horses that the enemy is using in this war. It is much faster and stronger than the Zerk horses, but it has a fiery temper making it harder to control. However, if you feed it bee flowers, the horse will become obedient. Chris is seen riding the horse, which increases his riding skill to 28. Pumpkin seems a little jealous, but Chris tells him there's no boy better than him. Pumpkin though still seems a little angry, but Chris apologizes to the wolf and says that they'll go on a scouting mission. Chris enters the forest landscape and recalls from his map that the village with untouched wells lies ahead, and where he is the shortest route to that village. He peeks through the trees and sees the enemy camp. Even though he trimmed their numbers down considerably, charging in blind wouldn't be a wise move. They need to strike unexpectedly. Chris and Pumpkin go back, and at nighttime he orders his troops to ready their horses. Lynn asks if they're going to go on a night raid, which Chris agrees since they're short on time. Chris asks Slithy if everything is ready, and to reiterate the mission code name, which is let's shake 'em up. The soldiers think this name is a little cringe, but they continue with their orders to split up. Sephoro comments if they can really traverse through the thick forest, but Chris just tells the man that he's judging superficially again. If we remove the vegetation, they're going to find fields of medicinal herbs. This area was scouted thoroughly by Murdoch. The soldiers move silently as possible, and they remove the vegetation. They arrive at the enemy camp, and the unsuspecting soldiers are drinking on guard duty. Tigo wonders if their forces are spread too thin, but Chris just says that everyone is in the right spot. A group of soldiers is watching their route for invasion, while others just save energy. They spot the supposed enemy commander, and Chris asks Lynn if he can make the shot. Lynn is surprised that he even asked. Next to that commander, a soldier asks him how he can drink at a time like this. This is the second smartest soldier, almost as smart as the guy from the supply camp. Oh my god. These guys, man. These guys. Before the commander can finish giving his lame-ass excuse, he's instantly dinked and killed on the spot, which scares the world's smartest soldier. Where the hell did that come from? He can't believe what he's seeing right now. Is he drunk too? Or is the enemy riding down on cavalry? The X-shaped scarred general is arriving at the camp and sees some of Chris's forces. He notices that the enemy is riding their horses and assumes that Chris must be nearby. Slithy sees the enemy and remembers Chris's orders. It was only to evade. Their horses are the same, so they shouldn't be able to catch up. They only need to shake him up a bit. The camp is now ravaged, and the brilliant soldier needs to escape to report the ambush, but Sephoro sees him and asks where he's going. Chris pursues him as he finishes up the camp. Chris calls for the boys, and it's time to honor their guest. The enemy general is infuriated at their lack of archers. They can't catch up to the enemy soldiers. He now realizes his mistake as he's gone too far and orders his squad to stop. He now knows Chris's resourcefulness and is fearful that he's falling into another one of his traps. One of his men says that a soldier from the camp is coming, and like deja vu, the enemy general thinks he's been had again. The soldiers tell the general that the camp has been assaulted, and the general's face seethes with anger, but he needs to stay calm. If they retreat now, they might get ambushed. He orders his men to split into 2 groups. The first group follows him, and the second keeps an eye on the surroundings. Chris sees the enemy squad and greets them head on. The 8-gauge general swats Lin's arrow, which signals to Chris that he is strong. They are elite soldiers. The enemy general grins, saying how arrows won't work on him, but they do work on his troops though, as Lin starts lighting them up. Both sides dismount, ready for the incoming battle, and the enemy general vows to kill Chris with his own hands. This bastard took everything from me. Huh? I don't even know who you are, says Chris. This makes the man's face turn into a devilish grin. He can no longer hide his anger. Sadly, we don't get to see the fight, but we can assume that Chris